Enough false promises. Barbados' Prime Minister Mia Mottley did not mince words as she chastised the world's richest countries for turning a blind eye to the effects of climate change at the opening of the World Leaders Summit of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27. Prime Minister Mottley said that rich industrialized countries have boosted themselves at the expense of poor and vulnerable regions in the past, and that history now returns in a different form as poorer, vulnerable regions are again reeling from the effects of the rich's endeavors to increase their wealth. As industrialized nations continue to spew carbon into the atmosphere, Mottley's Caribbean neighbors in St. Lucia and Dominica were, on the very day of her remarks, suffering the brunt of the effects of climate changes caused by those carbon emissions. The demonstrated lack of concern for countries and populations in harm's way, Mottley said, made her increasingly despondent. She questioned how rich countries were motivated to dish out funds for seemingly everything except for efforts to right their wrongs with regards to climate change.
We have the collective capacity to transform. We're in the country that built pyramids. We know what it is to remove slavery from our civilization. We know what it is to be able to find a vaccine within 2 years when a pandemic hits us. We know what it is to put a man on the moon, and now we put in rover on Mars. We know what it is. But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced.
Mottley called on the heads of world monetary institutions to enforce policies that could help countries mitigate the effects of climate change. The Barbadian Prime Minister also called out the people who she says have the power to change the situation but have not done anything about it.
I come from a small island state that has high ambition, but that is not able to deliver on that high ambition because the global industrial strategy that we have has fault lines in it. Our ability to access electric cars or our ability to access batteries or photovoltaic panels are constrained by those countries that have the dominant presence and can produce for themselves, but the global south remains at the mercy of the global north on these issues. But it isn't only in that. We heard Al Gore just now speak about the difference in the cost of capital to those of us in the global south. And I ask us, how many more people must speak before those of us who have the capacity to instruct our directors at the World Bank, is that called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development only for the 20th century? At the IMF, which at least has been trying more than the World Bank, how many more countries must falter, particularly in a world that is now suffering the consequences of war and inflation, and countries therefore are unable to meet the challenges of finding the necessary resources to finance their way to net zero. This world looks still too much like it did when it was part of an imperialistic empire.
With St. Lucia, Dominica, and Guadeloupe still assessing the damage from recent flash flooding, Belize reeling from the devastation of Hurricane Lisa, and the Bahamas now preparing for the approach of subtropical cyclone Nicole, the issue of loss and damage is again rearing its head. Mottley is just the latest among regional and international figures to call on richer countries to pay their dues to the countries which need to be compensated for damages suffered due to their vulnerability to the effects of climate change.
We believe that it is critical that we address the issue of loss and damage. The talk must come to an end. And I'd like to salute Denmark and Belgium and Scotland for their own modest ways of trying to accept the precepts and principles of loss and damage as critical and as morally just. But for loss and damage to work, we believe that it can't only be an issue of asking state parties to do the right thing, although they must. But we believe that the non-state actors and the stakeholders, the oil and gas companies, and those who facilitate them need to be brought into a special convocation between now and COP28. How do companies make $200 billion in profits in the last 3 months and not expect to contribute at least 10 cents in every dollar of profit to a loss and damage fund? This is what our people expect.
Last month, Timothy Antoine, governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, called on Caribbean leaders to have a united front and a tough stance on the issue of achieving climate justice at COP27.
Well, I think we have to stick together and make strong advocacy. And I expect going into COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, that the Caribbean's voice will be very loud and powerful and united on this issue of climate justice and the need for us to get access to climate finance. We all know it, but it has to be repeated. We are among the lowest emitters, but the hardest hit. And unfortunately, the resources promised under the Paris Agreement, that $100 billion per annum per year, those resources have not been forthcoming. And so we have been stymied in our efforts to build resilience. We need resources for adaptation, for building climate-smart agriculture, for building climate-resilient infrastructure. The fact of the matter is, when you build a sea defense now, you have to build it 3 or 4 feet higher than you normally would because of sea level rise. Those are real needs. And so when I was in Washington recently, for example, I was advocating very strongly for support for our region with respect to green finance, for the development of a green finance market in the Caribbean. I gave the example, in 2020, green bonds issued in the world, $270 billion, not $1 issued in the Caribbean. How could that be?
Some weeks prior to that, a young Ugandan climate activist challenged senior policy officials from these same countries, asking them who would be willing to commit funds to fight against the ravages of climate change. Their obvious reluctance was noted. COP27 UN climate talks began in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt on Sunday, November 6th, and will convene on Friday, November 18th.